Just to update people on the very long and ongoing discussions at the Dáil Reform Committee. Um, Fundamentally, what happened yesterday was extremely disappointing. We saw what happened last week, where there was an attempted stroke by the government to facilitate Michael Lowry to be a backbench government TD with his group, and yet sit in opposition benches. There was an agreement last week amongst the party leaders that a solution would be found, and there was a statement read out by the Chief Whip to the House which recognises an ambiguity in standing orders, which requires clarification in differentiating between members of the opposition and the government, and committed to work to secure agreement as soon as possible and acceptable to government and opposition as regards formation of technical groups. Unfortunately, the very opposite of that has happened. So we had no significant engagement from the government whatsoever at the committee meeting, which started last Friday, so a week ago now. There was no significant engagement on Friday, there was no significant engagement on Monday. Then there was reference to the government would have a proposal on Thursday. That proposal finally arrived yesterday, about 25 minutes before the meeting was due to start. And that proposal is not in tune with what was read out to the House. It does the opposite of providing clarification in differentiating between members of the opposition and the government. In fact, it deliberately creates a fudge and a supposedly kind of neither government nor opposition, but a secret third thing of unaligned, which just so happens to take key opposition slots, in particular leaders' questions and priority questions to ministers. These are things that are reserved for opposition parties, and everybody knows. Michael Lowry at the meeting said yesterday, without us, we wouldn't have a government. They participated in negotiations for government together. Michael Lowry led those negotiations, and the outcome of that was a programme for government and a number of ministers for them, and then in a parallel process, one of the Healy-Raes becoming a minister. Everybody knows they are backbench government TDs, and yet we have yet another proposal to treat them effectively as the opposition. They knew that this was the problem last week. There was no engagement with the opposition, so there was a lot of talk at the meeting of all the hard work the Chief Whip has done over the past week. That must have been back and forth with Michael Lowry, because there was no engagement with anyone on the opposition to try to find a compromise or a way forward here. And all the indications yesterday is that they were not for turning. They're absolutely committed that the Lowry group will get leaders' questions and priority questions. Obviously, Michael Lowry has been described in the media as the kingmaker of the government. From watching what happens in the Dáil Reform Committee, he increasingly looks like the Pied Piper of the government. He says at the meeting yesterday, I will not compromise on leaders' questions and priority questions for my group, and then the government chimes in to say they also will not compromise on leaders' questions and priority questions for his group. It's an incredible thing to see play out. It's in direct contradiction to what was agreed last week in terms of finding a resolution. To be clear, from the opposition side, there is not some attempt to deny Michael Lowry and his group the right to speak. They absolutely should have the right to speak in the Dáil. We have said we're willing to amend standing orders to say that they can be recognised as a technical group within government. They can be represented on the Dáil Business Committee and on the Standing Orders Committee, and should be assured their rights to speaking time from within government time. This is analogous to the situation of backbench Green TDs in the last Dáil, those who weren't technically in the government because they're not ministers, but are clearly supporting the government, a minority third party. That's effectively the same position that these people are in, and they should be treated as such, which comes with a lot of rights. It comes with a lot of capacity. They can ask the Taoiseach questions. There's questions on promised legislation. They can ask the ministers questions. There's oral PQs for ministers. There is plenty of opportunities for these people to speak within government time, and it is simply a stroke. At the meeting last week with the leaders, Micheál Martin and Simon Harris, and subsequently in the media, were really emphasising that there was no deal with Lowry on speaking time. I have to say, people who saw them say that said that they seemed to say it with sincerity, but the evidence would suggest that there's a deal here. It's very, very hard to explain the government's behaviour if they don't have to try to allow Lowry to be on the opposition benches, to facilitate it with key opposition slots in terms of leaders' questions and priority questions. Why are they bending over backwards? Why are they creating this new imaginary category of unaligned, which, by the way, exists in standing orders but means something different than what they're talking about? What unaligned currently means is you're not in a political party or technical group. In the past, say Violet Ann Wynne at a certain stage was in that point. The Fianna Fáil guy in McSharry from Sligo was in that position. That's a category that exists, but the government's now trying to say that we have a thing called the government, we have a thing called the opposition, and then there's people who are unaligned. That doesn't exist anywhere else in standing orders. It doesn't make sense. And also, to be clear, they're refusing to say what the consequences of this are in terms of resourcing and in terms of committee positions. So they're refusing to say, does this entitle the Lowry Group to a committee chair from the opposition allocation as opposed to from the government allocation? I suspect it does, and there's a whole lot of, does it entitle them to private members' bills? All they will say is, we're not proposing that now, but they won't give any guarantee that they're not proposing that in a week's time if they manage to get through the Dáil next week. What I hope is that the government will have done some reflection over the evening, will have hopefully spoke to their party leaders, the Taoiseach and Taoiseach, and will be actually willing to compromise, which is conceding on the fact that they cannot be treated as if they're opposition TDs, they cannot get leaders' questions and priority questions, but should be assured their rights as a technical group within the government. Like, that's what I'm hoping for. We will see in half an hour whether there is any move in relation to that. If there isn't progress today on that, and we're willing to discuss like what that looks like in terms of a technical group arrangement and so on, but if there isn't progress on that, then the next point kind of technically is that there will be another meeting of the Dáil Reform Committee, presumably next Tuesday, in person, and a formal meeting which is capable of voting on that. And then, at the moment it certainly looks like the government will try to use their majority at the Dáil Reform Committee and at the Business Committee to ram through this proposal in contradiction to what was said. If that's what happens, and we hope that isn't what happens, then I really don't see how the opposition is left with any choice but to protest robustly next week and not to accept this, significant incursion into the rights of the opposition to hold the government to account. I think we have a duty to protect our ability to do that, and so that's certainly why I hope that there is move this morning from the government. But certainly from our perspective, we cannot just allow this stroke to take place for the rights of the opposition to be undermined in a very, very significant way, and then just to accept that business goes ahead as normal. Obviously, there's lots of things we want to debate. We want to debate the impact of the storms, all the people who are still left without electricity. We want to debate the programme for government. But if we accept next week a diminution, a significant undermining of the rights of the opposition, then effectively the government will bank that and then move on to try and further diminish in the future. So I think it will be incumbent on us to take a united stand, and so far all the indications from the opposition, from the real opposition, so accepting the Lowry Group, all the other opposition groups are absolutely in lockstep that this is not acceptable. There's two contradictory pieces of information. One is Micheál Martin and Simon Harris swear that there was no deal on this. They've said that publicly and they've said that privately. On the other hand, you have the government really bending over backwards to facilitate Michael Lowry, trying to create a whole new category, just trying to find one way and being absolutely obstinate in that, not being willing to compromise. That for me certainly raises a question over the protestations that there was no such deal. I don't understand. What's currently happening does not make sense unless there is a deal with Lowry. That's the funny thing, is if Lowry is, as he now claims to be, not supporting the government, going to choose on a case-by-case basis, then why on earth is the government bending over backwards to facilitate them in the way that they're doing? So certainly it seems to me now that there's a lot of evidence, that circumstantial evidence, to go towards the fact that there is some deal here, that the government feels obliged to follow Lowry down every track, facilitate him in any way. Like I said at the meeting yesterday, a key turning point was when he came in and said, I won't be accepting any compromise, and then the government just followed him in that, and it's not accepting a compromise. If we end up at the end of this process where we are now, then certainly in hindsight it will look like an agreement was reached last week, giving an indication that they would do clarification in differentiating between members of the opposition and government. They would do it in such a way as soon as possible and acceptable to government and opposition. They agreed to say that, and then they didn't follow through on any of those things. So they just did it to get over the hump of the necessity of getting Micheál Martin elected as Taoiseach, and then effectively counted on just being able to use their majority to bulldoze this through. I think they've made a strategic error in that. I think they underestimate how opposed the opposition are to this, and they also underestimate the attitude of the public to this. I mean, it was interesting. There was a number of comments from government TDs yesterday saying, oh, the opposition, the public, they're opposed to both sides on this, and they're angry at both sides. And whereas the truth is, that's not my experience. My experience is the public is surprisingly engaged on this issue. You know, on the face of it, it's a relatively technical issue to do with standing orders in the Dáil, but I think people get it, that this is a stroke to facilitate Michael Lowry, it's a stroke to undermine the position of the opposition. So I think the government will be making a significant mistake if they continue on the road that they're on.